Stories of Your Life and Others is a short story collection written by Ted Chiang and published in 2002. It collects short stories from 1990 to 2001 written by him. I love science fiction short stories. It's what initially got me into the genre. So I don't really read collections that often, but I wanted to give it a shot. And so I looked online, and pretty much every list that I was looking at said that this was a must read. This book was really eye-opening to me. I think that up until now, I had been really conditioned to expect in short stories a big, long build-up and then a punchline that blows your mind. That's absolutely not what Ted Chiang does. I would argue it's probably way harder to write it the way that Ted Chiang does. He builds up a compelling narrative, and by the end, you don't feel like you need to rely on some gimmicky one-liner to close the story. In my opinion, while I thought every short story in this collection was generally quite good, there were two that really stood out among the rest. And these two I want to spend more time speaking on, so I'm going to go over my 6 least favorite, if you can call it that, and then I'll speak a little bit more on my 2 favorite ones. I think that each of these stories is like if Chiang has a question, like, what if humans colonized Pluto? And then he pretty much just takes that question and runs with it. I think he does a fantastic job being like, trust me, this is what would happen in this circumstance. And he unquestionably convinced me each time. So I'm going to state also what I think is the question of each of these stories. I'll start with 72 Letters. This one is essentially an alternate history, steampunk reality, where tech goes in this direction where we program these large anthropomorphic machines to do tasks by giving them names. I did think that the intermingling of real-world stuff like the British Museum with fake fantasy science fiction things like mermaids and undines was pretty cool, but in general, this one just did not grip me too much. This one answers the question, what if technology was run by mechanized automatons that were programmed by words? The Evolution of Human Science is a super short, like 5-page story that reads like some futuristic pamphlet that details human science in the future. In this future, humans are divided into 2 groups. There's regular humans, and then there's these hyper-capable meta-humans. It's an interesting idea, but it's short, and I just can't say it wowed me enough to stick with me beyond just how long it took to read it. This one answers the question, how would research change if we developed artificial general intelligence? Story of Your Life is, of course, the titular story in this collection. In this one, aliens come to Earth, and because of their alienness, we are unable to communicate with them. So this story follows a linguist who leads one of the many teams that are working, trying to communicate with the aliens. Basically, half the passages are anecdotes from the main character's past/future, and the other half follows the main character and her team as they attempt to communicate with the aliens. In terms of themes, the story challenges the idea of the linearity of time and what that means for free will as a result. I think one way to classically judge science fiction is how good is the author at writing aliens. And I think that Chiang does a great job making some compelling aliens in his story. They're well described and they're unique, but not in a scary way, which I feel like is an easy cop-out for a lot of authors. This story answers the question, what if aliens came to Earth but we couldn't communicate with them? Tower of Babylon is a depiction of someone working on the biblical Tower of Babylon from the Bible. It follows them as they walk up the giant tower, and by giant I mean it literally goes past the moon, the sun, the stars. My eyes kind of rolled when I saw this was about something biblical, especially since it was this first story in the collection, because I don't know a lot about theism, and sometimes it just gets a little bit annoying because a lot of religious stories require a lot of background information to really appreciate it. Like even reading Book of the New Sun, I feel like I'm missing out on so much because I don't know a lot about Catholicism. But this one is not like that. This story, you really didn't need to know anything about Christianity. This story is just so crisply written, and the world is so vivid and interesting. It's like clean and tidy, and it's like the story version of when you do this with your hands after a job well done. This one answers the question, what if humans wanted to build the tallest tower possible? In Division by Zero, a mathematician named Renee discovers that mathematics is inconsistent, and this causes her extreme mental anguish. She does not cope well and ends up in a psychiatric ward. This one does this cool thing where it's written in chunks, and each chunk is made up of 3 smaller chunks. The first chunk being some lecture, like mini lecture or short story about mathematics history. The second one being the point of view of Renee talking about something, and then the third one being the point of view of her husband, Carl, talking about something. Each chunk is metaphorically related, where the mathematic story has to do something with Renee and Carl's stories later on in the chunk. It's a pretty novel idea, and I think that I liked it a little bit extra because I'll admit I have a soft spot for any story that does a halfway decent job of describing a inpatient treatment facility for mental or physical health. This one answers the question, what would be the academic fallout if we figured out mathematics was wrong? In Understand, the main character, Leon, has a traumatic physical event which causes him to go into a vegetative state, and the doctors try out this new treatment called Hormone K on him. And it works, but much more effectively than the scientists thought it could. It slingshots his previously nearly non-existent intelligence all the way to the other end of the spectrum, essentially making him a brilliant mastermind. This story is pretty much just Chiang playing with the idea of how a hyper-intelligent human might act. One really neat but probably maybe overlooked thing in this story was how the language changes. As Leon gets slowly increasingly more intelligent throughout the story, the language slowly ramps up in sophistication, but it never gets overly edgy where it sounds like a Redditor that thinks they're super smart or something. It's really page-turning, and I suppose the one thing that I would criticize is that it makes the assumption that most of science fiction does, which is that if we have increased intelligence or even like nearly infinite intelligence, we will for sure use it for furthering humanity and understanding of things rather than increasing our own internal happiness. But I get that's a really hippie take, and I digress. This one answers the question, what if a human's intelligence ballooned exponentially? All right, now time for me to talk about my 2 favorite stories. To me, these are just in a league of their own. They're the types of stories that you read and then you're reminded why you can't be an author. I was literally giddy reading these stories, which I can only really say for a handful of books or stories that I have ever read. These are the types of stories that are intimidating as someone who wants to review things because they're literally so good that I feel like I cannot do them justice. Let me do a quick aside though first. In the past few months, I've been thinking a lot about what is it that I really like about science fiction? What makes it so great? What brings me back to this genre all the time? And I think that these 2 stories are perfect case studies for the importance of science fiction. In my opinion, the best sci-fi describes and highlights things in the world in a way that traditional fiction just can't. By putting readers in a meticulously well set up situation, authors can highlight certain elements of societies in ways that they can't in other mediums, I think. It's the unrealness of these stories that makes them so vividly real. Anyway, let's talk about my 2 favorite stories. In Hell is the Absence of God, all the elements of Christianity are real. Souls, heaven, hell, angels, etc. They're all real and physically visible in life. Blessings are real, and they're measured just like someone would measure the temperature for the day. In this world, angels will come down from heaven to heal people, but ironically, people will be caught in the crossfire and get injured sometimes, and sometimes even die. During the majority of the story, we follow Neil, whose wife is one of those unlucky people who experiences the devastation of one of these visitations. As his wife died because she was sitting in a cafe, an angel came down to heal someone. It broke through the window, the glass hit her, and she bled out. This, in addition to the debilitating leg injury that Neil suffered at birth, causes him to really grapple with his view of God. He wants to go to heaven because his wife is there, but how can he wholeheartedly believe in God when they've caused him so much great suffering? He feels condemned to hell, saying, quote, "For people like him, hell was where you went when you died, and he saw no point in restructuring his life in hopes of avoiding that." And since God hadn't previously played a role in Neil's life, he wasn't afraid of being exiled from God. The prospect of living without interference, living in a world where windfalls and misfortunes were never by design, held no terror for him. As the title of the story says, hell is the absence of God. And Neil thinks, hey, the world with God is not that great, so let's give the world without God a shot. His feelings of betrayal by God hit deep to how a lot of people feel disconnected from God, especially when God is supposed to be this all-powerful being, yet they let all these atrocities happen. So sorry, I'm going to do something very cringe, and I'm going to quote rap lyrics, but this theme reminds me a lot of a Biggie Smalls song, which starts, quote, "When I die, fuck it, I want to go to hell, 'cause I'm a piece of shit and ain't hard to fucking tell. It don't make sense going to heaven with the goody-goodies. I like black Tims and black hoodies." In honesty, I don't even remember too much about the rest of the plot of the story beyond this, because to me, the story was all about Chiang exploring religion and doing this through the lens of this theoretical society. The story has tons of complex religious sentiments that I felt in my own life, but it depicts them in this story in a way that's otherwise been hard for me to express. For example, Neil is really envious of some of the extremely hardcore Christians because he yearns for this wholehearted belief in something greater than himself. He wonders if it's right to just say, hey, I don't really buy into everything, but at least I want to believe in something. Neil wonders if, quote, "It'd be better to live in a story where the righteous were rewarded and the sinners were punished, even if the criteria for righteousness and sinfulness eluded him, rather than live in a reality where there was no justice at all." And I think this is very relatable. In a world with so much tragedy and uncertainty, it's understandable why some people might turn a blind eye to logic for the sake of feeling a wholehearted conviction in an omnipresent, benevolent, greater meaning. There are people in Chiang's world that clearly use God as a coping mechanism, which is something that I've struggled with a lot in my life. I, for example, have a friend who used to struggle with addiction before he sort of found faith in God and used that as a way to battle out of that. Now, even if God is fake, was the concept of them not real and useful to my friend? Another thing I love is how Chiang portrays the people's attribution of pretty much everything to God. If you have a broken fingernail, you must have done something to annoy God. If you win the lottery, you must have done something to earn their favor. If you ever watch pro sports, you know that in all the victory speeches, they often thank God a lot. And to me, that's because of this. It's a coping skill for people that otherwise have no reason to have received these unbelievable physical gifts at birth. And for that reason, they are millionaires. And I see this as essentially a coping mechanism for that. Now, obviously, in real life, people don't attribute every single thing to God, but is God's inaction regarding horrible personal atrocities like miscarriages, schizophrenia, cancer, is this not a way of them endorsing the outcomes? Anyway, multiple times throughout the story, Neil sort of feels that he needs to learn to, quote, love God well, he still has the chance, which was a refreshingly straightforward presentation of what I find to be one of the most ironically vindictive tenets of Christianity. There's even commentary on some not religious stuff, like comparing trauma and the three-dimensionality of it, where it's impossible to completely understand someone else's trauma because everyone's situation is so unique. There are literally so many connections and metaphors relating to theism that I won't list, but I just found my mind being constantly blown almost every single page with all these sophisticated commentaries on concepts and ideas I have thought about most of my life. I could see how this story might be enormously offensive to some people, and I love that. This is one of those stories that just scratches that otherwise unscratchable itch of yours when advocating ideas that are otherwise impossible to express. In Liking What You See, a documentary, there is this technology called caliagnosia, or simply Cali, that can be used to basically make you ignorant of beauty. If you see someone's face, you don't see them as pretty or ugly, you just see them mathematically. In this story, Chiang asks the question, how much of life would be affected by the introduction of some technology like this? And what would happen, good or bad, if we were to stop focusing on beauty? Chiang takes this very nuanced issue, which is our inherent predisposition to letting looks affect our actions, and approaches it in a very mature way, commenting on it from as many sides as possible. He lays out the arguments from all sides, and he lets readers come up with their own ideas and thoughts on the matter. The story goes through all possible repercussions of a technology like this. It's presented as an interview-style documentary, talking to seemingly every type of person about this technology. It talks to conservatives, liberals, religious people, ugly people, pretty people, people that grew up with it and then had it removed, people that did not grow up with it and then got it turned on. For example, one person who is against Cali talks about it by comparing it to the Olympics. When you watch the Olympics, you don't feel bad about yourself for how talented they are. It makes you proud to be a human and to see life pushed to an extreme, even if it's not by you. A proponent of Cali describes pharmaceutical beauty like cocaine. They say that the plant that cocaine comes from is not necessarily that addictive and dangerous, but when it becomes refined into something like cocaine, it becomes addictive. They say that beauty can be categorized as a drug just like how we categorize anything else as drugs because it affects relationships. Anyway, the story consists of just a plethora of these types of arguments and anecdotes from everyone from like college first years to neuroscience professors. I don't even feel like it's appropriate for me to really comment my take on the issue or what I think about the technology because the thoughts of the people in the story are laid out just so perfectly that frankly I'd find it unfair to try to convince you or even tell you my thoughts one way or another without you reading it. I will comment a little bit on the natural theoretical expansion of this because there is some obvious places that this can be taken. The most obvious probably is, what if there was some technology that was implemented that did something like this about race? Would it be okay to make us ignorant of race? I would say the huge difference between something like race and something like beauty is that beauty, there's no like history, generational history when it comes to ugliness or prettiness. And there's no sort of cultural element of it like there is with race. There are also tons of other places that this sort of blindness to attributes can be taken to in theory. Like, is it fair to utilize a tool that neutralizes paralinguistic cues to make it so that everything that someone says is sort of narrowed down to just the exact specifics of it? Some are even talked about in this story. So, as you can see, talking about some technology like this just absolutely opens up a can of worms. I found myself feeling really strongly, real strong personal feelings about some of the people's comments within this story. And I even argued with some people in real life when I was talking with them about this story. And Chiang's ability to sort of comment and provoke such a visceral reaction from me just really speaks to what a brilliant story this is in my eyes. All right, so let's wrap this up with me sharing just some final thoughts about the book overall. I generally don't like reading entire books consisting of short stories because it just feels like, why not just cherry pick some of the best of them? Well, I wanted to give a collection a try, and I think this one was a great one to do it for. Some were clearly highlights for me, but there were absolutely no duds. Sometimes me and my dad shoot the shit and we'll just like smoke cigars and be like, what do you think would happen if LeBron was traded to the Knicks? And this book is sort of like that theory crafting if it was done on science fiction and done in a much more intelligent manner. Chiang is such a reliable author. When you read science fiction, you do have to naturally suspend belief about some things. That's just the genre. But when Chiang writes about these scenarios, I find myself just thinking, oh yeah, that is exactly how that would play out. And when he writes characters, I'm like, oh, that is just exactly how people would react in that situation. Chiang writes like someone who is smarter than you, and not in like a braggadocious or poser-like way. Like, he's definitely smarter than you, but not in an arrogant way. It feels like he knows his stuff, and that's even when he's talking about some impossible science fiction technology or something like that. In this book, you can be along for the ride in his stories and know that you are in extremely capable, knowledgeable hands. Thanks for watching.